In the dead of a winter night, while Europe slept under a fragile truce, a storm was already gathering behind the smiles of diplomatic handshakes, one that would shatter trust and plunge millions into unthinkable chaos. The world had watched in disbelief as two nations, ideologically opposed yet pragmatically aligned, signed a pact that would redefine the boundaries of war: Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, inked in August 1939, promised non-aggression between Hitler's Third Reich and Stalin's USSR. Yet beneath the ink lay calculated deceit. On one side, Hitler nursed an ambition that could not coexist with any form of peace beyond temporary advantage. On the other, Stalin clung to fragile assurances while preparing the Soviet Union's massive, sprawling machinery of defense. Both leaders were strategists, both were manipulators. But only one planned betrayal. By September 1939, as Germany unleashed blitzkrieg on Poland, the world saw perfect, if temporary, alignment. Soviet troops moved in from the east under the guise of protecting territories promised by secret protocols of the pact. Politicians spoke of stability, yet generals whispered of inevitable confrontation. The alliance was already cracking from its core. Moscow's corridors of power buzzed with unease. Stalin's advisors debated the wisdom of trusting Hitler, yet their warnings were muted by years of purges and an ingrained paranoia of internal dissent. Meanwhile, Germany's military strategists refined Operation Barbarossa in absolute secrecy, drawing lines on maps, calculating timetables, and imagining a Europe free from the Eastern menace. By early 1941, both nations had benefited from their cooperation. Germany could divert its attention westward, confident that the USSR would remain neutral. The Soviet Union expanded its borders into the Baltic states and eastern Poland, consolidating resources and manpower. Superficially, the pact worked, but the shadow of betrayal loomed larger with each passing day. Within this tense calm, ordinary soldiers, citizens, and leaders went about their lives, oblivious to the impending calamity. Families in Moscow and Berlin felt only the distant tremors of a war that would soon engulf their homes. Hitler's generals knew, and Stalin's spies feared, the unspoken truth: peace was a lie, waiting only for the precise moment to shatter. By the time spring approached in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the betrayal in its most catastrophic form, was set in motion. Germany would turn overnight from ally to invader, revealing the darkest ambitions hidden beneath political theater. What followed would be chaos, fire, and a brutal clash that would redefine the course of history. The air in Berlin was thick with expectation and secrecy. Hitler's generals pored over maps in dimly lit rooms, their fingers tracing the lines of an invasion that would shatter the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact forever. Names like Army Group North, Center, and South were whispered like sacred incantations. Each unit represented not just soldiers but carefully calculated instruments of betrayal. In contrast, Moscow still clung to the illusion of peace. Stalin, notoriously suspicious yet surprisingly trusting of intelligence reports that confirmed his optimism, walked through the Kremlin halls with a sense of uneasy vigilance. His advisors debated, argued, and pleaded for readiness, but the purges of the 1930s had hollowed the military leadership. Many feared speaking too loudly, and many more had been eliminated. The warnings existed, but in the shadows, where they went unheard. By spring 1941, the German war machine moved with silent precision. Tanks, artillery, and infantry columns amassed along the border under strict secrecy. Supply depots were positioned strategically, rail lines were reinforced, and communication systems were secured. The operation was meticulous, each soldier knew their role, each general their responsibility, and Hitler's eyes never left the ultimate prize, Moscow. On the Soviet side, reconnaissance flights spotted German movements, but the data was misinterpreted or dismissed. Intelligence officers sent urgent dispatches about troop buildups and suspicious logistics, only to be overruled by higher commands who feared provoking Hitler prematurely. For Stalin, the pact remained a fragile shield; for Hitler, it was a temporary obstacle. In the small villages along the Soviet-German border, life carried on in oblivion. Farmers plowed fields, children played near the rivers, and border guards patrolled roads, unaware that the largest military assault in history was quietly assembling just miles away. Soldiers joked, families dined, and the horizon appeared calm, but beneath that calm was a storm that would erupt in unparalleled fury. The tension between preparation and ignorance, between secrecy and assumption, created a strange duality. German officers trained for invasion drills with clinical precision. Soviet soldiers practiced defensive formations that would never be used effectively. And in the shadows, Hitler's planners laughed at their own duplicity, fully aware that every handshake, every diplomatic note, and every Soviet smile was part of the illusion. Then came June. The sun rose over frozen rivers and early summer meadows. For Germany, it was the dawn of execution. For the Soviet Union, it was a morning that began like any other, innocent, routine, yet perilously fragile. Messages were sent. Orders were given. Trucks rolled into position. Bombers took off for reconnaissance that would never alert the enemy to the truth. The first shots were scheduled for early morning, a synchronized betrayal that would stretch across hundreds of miles. Hitler had spent years planning this exact moment. Stalin, meanwhile, clung to a fragile faith in treaties, unable to imagine the suddenness with which his world was about to collapse. In private chambers, generals argued and calculated. In the streets, civilians continued daily routines. The stage was set, and the actors were blind to their roles in history's most ruthless play. As Part 2 closes, the tension tightens. The invisible lines between trust and treachery, between allies and enemies, are about to vanish in a single, devastating sweep. The world would soon see that promises can be weaponized, and peace can be an invitation to annihilation. June 22, 1941, broke with a cold, silent dawn, but soon the silence was shattered. German planes streaked across the sky in formation, their engines roaring like iron beasts. The first bombs fell with surgical precision, targeting Soviet airfields, rail hubs, and command centers. Soldiers awoke to explosions, the ground trembling beneath them. Civilians screamed. The world they knew was obliterated in hours. Across hundreds of miles, blitzkrieg unfolded with horrifying efficiency. Tanks crushed roads, artillery pounded villages, and infantry advanced with deadly coordination. The Soviet army, caught unprepared, scrambled to respond. Units were isolated, communications jammed, and entire divisions destroyed before they could even fire a shot. The betrayal was not just political, it was tactical, ruthless, and complete. In the border town of Brest, soldiers and civilians alike tried to organize defenses. Families huddled in basements, watching their homes burn. The local commander, an experienced officer, radioed Moscow repeatedly for reinforcements that were delayed or never came. Panic spread as the German advance cut supply lines and severed communications. Trust was shattered, and the illusion of allyship dissolved into smoke and fire. In Berlin, Hitler's generals reported victories with measured satisfaction. Each town captured, each regiment destroyed, was a confirmation that their meticulous planning had worked. They celebrated the precision, ignoring the human cost behind their maps. Meanwhile, Stalin and his inner circle grappled with disbelief. The reports came in fragmented, horrifyingly inconsistent, painting a picture of devastation far beyond imagination. The shockwaves reached the front lines. Young soldiers, barely trained, were thrown into combat against well-prepared and highly coordinated German units. Some fought with bravery, others froze under the shock of betrayal. Civilians, too, resisted where they could, forming ad hoc militias, hiding supplies, and sending messages to higher command, hoping, praying, that reinforcements would arrive in time. By the afternoon, entire sectors had fallen. German tanks pierced deep into Soviet territory. Artillery barrages leveled towns that had stood for centuries. Smoke rose in thick, choking clouds, carrying with it the scent of betrayal and the screams of the defenseless. Hitler had turned the alliance into a weapon, and the full force of his treachery was on display. Amid the chaos, soldiers' thoughts were raw and human. A young Soviet lieutenant crouched behind a shattered wall, remembering his mother's warning to trust no one. He felt the bitter irony: his greatest enemy had been his supposed ally. Another officer, wounded and exhausted, gritted his teeth as he sent desperate messages to the rear. Civilians hid, prayed, and cried in the shadows. The scale of betrayal was staggering. By nightfall, German forces had advanced tens of miles into Soviet territory, and the reality sank in: this was no temporary skirmish. It was a calculated, full-scale assault designed to annihilate. The Eastern Front had erupted into a nightmare, and for millions, there would be no escape. The Soviets, reeling from the initial onslaught, began to organize a desperate defense. Entire cities were mobilized. Factories transformed into bunkers, trains ferried troops to the front lines, and civilians joined militias. Heroes emerged in the chaos, ordinary men and women who found extraordinary courage. In the city of Smolensk, soldiers dug trenches while families brought food and water. Each hour became a battle for survival. Communications were fragmented, and reinforcements often arrived too late, or not at all. Officers made impossible decisions: which towns to defend, which roads to abandon, which lives to risk. Every choice carried consequences. Amid the turmoil, an understated call echoed in the digital age: by the way, if you're clinging to this moment with me, make sure to hit subscribe, more waits just ahead. The story surged on, unbroken, as the fight intensified. Battles were fought in streets, forests, and fields. The Soviets employed scorched earth tactics, destroying resources to deny them to the Germans. Yet the German advance was relentless. Tanks crushed barricades. Infantry stormed fortified positions. The world teetered on the edge of annihilation, and the cost of betrayal became painfully visible. Stories of heroism and heartbreak intertwined. A small Soviet unit held a bridge for 3 days, buying time for civilians to flee. Mothers carried children through smoke and debris. Soldiers wrote letters they knew they might never finish. The human spirit persisted, even under the shadow of overwhelming odds. The winter was still months away, but the harshness of the terrain began to take its toll. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Soldiers suffered from exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Yet they fought on, driven by loyalty to a nation blindsided by treachery. Entire regions burned. Minsk, Smolensk, and other key towns were engulfed by fire and artillery. Civilians fled in rivers of humanity, their paths marked by smoke and ash. German forces consolidated gains, establishing control with brutal efficiency. The Soviet command, reorganizing in makeshift headquarters, faced the monumental task of protecting millions. Strategic decisions were heartbreaking: retreat and save lives, or defend and risk annihilation. Every choice carried moral weight, and every error multiplied the suffering. Amid the chaos, soldiers and civilians alike endured unimaginable horrors. Accounts describe families trapped in burning buildings, officers sacrificing themselves to delay enemy forces, and communities reduced to rubble. The psychological toll was immense, with fear and courage constantly intertwined. Winter approached, and Germany's advance faltered. Soviet forces, strengthened by reinforcements and resilient supply chains, began to counterattack. Harsh weather, logistical errors, and overextended lines forced the Germans to rethink strategies. Stories of resistance inspired hope. Local militias, armed with courage and improvised weapons, harassed German units. Entire Soviet divisions, previously underestimated, mounted strategic offensives. Cities that were nearly lost were slowly reclaimed, demonstrating the resilience of a nation betrayed but unbroken. The conflict became a grinding war of attrition. Every victory was hard-won, and every loss was devastating. Yet the Eastern Front was shifting, slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. By 1942, the scale of Germany's betrayal was fully realized. Millions dead, cities destroyed, and trust obliterated. The war reshaped Europe, redrew political lines, and left scars that would endure for generations. Stalin's purges, Hitler's ambitions, and the human cost were all intertwined. Historians later reflected on the calculated deceit, the bravery of ordinary people, and the catastrophic consequences of broken alliances. The betrayal of 1941 was more than a military maneuver, it was a lesson in the fragility of trust, the brutality of unchecked ambition, and the indomitable spirit of those who resist even in the darkest hours. The Eastern Front became a testament to human courage amid the horrors of war, forever remembered in history's pages.